To a certain extent, I would like now, for the remainder of the questions that I'm going to be directing you to look at some specifics within those questions, because we have the answers to your questions, to the questions that you were posed in your written responses. So I'm going to try to be perhaps a little more focused as we proceed today. Can I turn to question 3, which relates to a human rights-based approach to specifically vaccine passports and/or track and trace? Now, I'm particularly interested in your views as to whether passports and/or track and trace present any particular human rights considerations. And my specific interest is in relation to vaccines. And it's a situation where someone has a principled objection to being vaccinated. Now, that principled objection may be based on religious grounds. It may be that someone is concerned that a vaccine which was rolled out so quickly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, there may be concern as to the safety of that vaccine. And I want to look at that particularly in the context of the need to be vaccinated as a requirement for employment or possibly otherwise travel. So if we can begin, first of all, with the general question of particular human rights considerations with regards to passports and track and trace. And if perhaps I could begin, Professor Busby, with you. Do you see any particular human rights considerations there? And if so, what are they?
Thank you. Yeah, this is quite a difficult question in relation to the specific question that you've posed there, which is the principled objection to being vaccinated. We spoke yesterday about the convention rights, particularly Article 2, the right to life, which we surmised, I surmised, could potentially be engaged in this context, but hasn't been. So I think it's interesting to reflect on the realities of that and what that actually means for using human rights in this particular way. I think early on in the last experience, the last pandemic experience, when we spoke yesterday as well about the uncertainty that we all faced, including decision makers, there was a move to think about vaccination as a mandatory action, which should, if it wasn't done, restrict people's employment, travel opportunities and so on. And that may be right in some respects. So if we're thinking about somebody who works, for example, with particularly vulnerable populations who refuses to be vaccinated, there probably are very good grounds, human rights grounds, and you could engage Article 2 here in saying we have to protect the right to life of the people that will be exposed potentially to the individual, but that you have to weigh that up against things like testing. You know, once we had the opportunity to test regularly, is the danger so great that the person's, right to employment should be restricted? I think these are difficult balancing exercises to do in practice, particularly in light of the kind of unknown consequences or circumstances that we found ourselves in last time. So I think it depends on all sorts of factors, but I would be very reluctant to say that human rights arguments could be used in such a way as to act as a restriction on someone's employment opportunities and ability to travel that might seem punitive, if that's the right way of putting it. I think the objections there are too strong. We spoke yesterday about the need to weigh, if we're going to invoke a particular human right, say under the convention, we have to think about the impact of that on the other rights within the convention and elsewhere, that it might impinge on. And so we do need to think there about, we talked about proportionality, about necessity, and I think that those things would come into play here. So it's hard to give a complete answer without knowing what the fuller circumstances are in terms of things like the ability to test, reliable testing, for example, and the specific circumstance of that employment, the specific circumstance of that travel arrangement or whatever. But I would be hesitant to say that we could use, generally, we could use those kinds of human rights objections to prohibit on a wide scale or a large scale those types of activities without looking at the intelligence at the time. I think there's a lot there that we need to consider, actually, before moving to a strong human rights objection, if that's the right way to put it.
Thank you. Professor Parker, do you have a view on that?
So I'm not coming at this from a legal background, just a few thoughts. I guess so people's principles and values matter, and that people, generally speaking, shouldn't be ruled out from employment because of those. The right of conscientious objection, I think, captures that in many respects. I think facts matter, though. So I think, and there could be another thing. So one possibility is, what are the options for task shifting? Can people be employed in ways which minimise harms in some ways? Can they be doing jobs that could be done without being, let's say, vaccinated? That's one thing. I think a lot depends on the way in which the vaccine works. So if it were a vaccine that blocked transmission, one might think differently about it if it was one that didn't block transmission effectively or as effectively. So these things, I think, matter. I also think, but on the other hand, so if you think about things like health and safety, we're used to the idea that we can place some restrictions on people's way people work. So if I were working in a job which required me to handle uncooked food, for example, I was going to butcher or something, and I said on principle I refused to wash my hands or to wear one of those hats that people wear if they, then I think we would say, well, I'm sorry, you can't work here. And I mean, obviously reasonable adjustments need to be made, but there are some situations where we do restrict people's employment opportunities. Another would be someone on the building site who refused to wear a hard hat. So it's not impossible and not unreasonable to place restrictions on someone's opportunity for employment and their freedom within that domain. But nonetheless, that ought to be used judiciously and carefully. So that's one thing I think that's. But yeah, there are all sorts of rights questions, moral and legal, to do with fair opportunities for employment and equal treatment, fair treatment in the workplace.
Does that, and implicit in what you're saying, does that, to a certain extent, if one is dealing with a principled objection, I think you've given the example of refusing to wear a hard hat. And I think the one that I thought of is somebody smoking in an atmosphere where there are hazardous and potentially explosive and fire-generating substances. One can understand the requirement there and how that would outweigh the right to light up. But does this, to a certain extent, throw the onus slightly back onto an employer to look? You mentioned the possibility of finding alternative employment and within the workplace. So this there is a route, I suppose, which is depending upon the flexibility of the employer.
Yeah, and I think there are two types of responsibilities of the employer here. One is the safety of the customers or the clients or the residents, let's say, in a care home, and the other is the safety of those who are employed. Builders are required to wear hard hats because employers have responsibilities to their employees rather than the people who are going to buy the houses. So those two things, that's absolutely right. I think the responsibility ultimately is on employers, and they should do all they can to make it possible for people for a very wide range of people to do those jobs, assuming they've got the relevant skills. But there are limits to that, and there will be times when I imagine, when it's appropriate to say, this is not a job that can be done by someone who refuses to do certain things. And I mean, the implication of this is that, were the vaccine shown to be transmission blocking, and there was a serious risk, I do think there are circumstances in which it would be reasonable to say you can't work here unless you have a vaccine. And we also have a particular there's a way of thinking about these things in the UK that may be different to other places. So, for example, before the pandemic, I do a lot of work together with Johns Hopkins University, and it's a requirement for students and staff to get, has been for a long time, to get the flu vaccine to come into the university. So, in other places there are these kind of requirements. We don't tend to do that, but it's not unusual for there to be a requirement of that type.
You mentioned specifically in the beginning of that answer to care homes. Does the concern of certainly those who have relatives or loved ones in care homes in the context of a pandemic and something that is spread in the way that COVID-19 was spread, and a vaccine becomes available as it did, do you see any difficulty with ensuring that, and by that I mean mandatory ensuring, that that workers within the care home are vaccinated?
I mean, there are a number of factual questions that So, for example, if there was strong evidence by requiring vaccination you were going to lose a lot of staff, people would just leave the jobs. Let's say that would be another way that people could be put at risk. So those kind of questions are going to matter. I'm not saying that would happen, but that's a relevant question I think to ask. So there are a number of possible harms that could arise from a decision of this kind, and it may in certain cases be a difficult judgment between those. But I think we have obligations. We have obligations where we can to protect those who, in this case, are being cared for in care homes. We'd have similar concerns about other vulnerable groups in other kinds of situations too.
Yes. Excuse me. I've been asking these questions in the context of employment. The other category that I suppose one would want to consider are the relatives of people in care homes. Now, one point that we've taken in this inquiry from the evidence that we've heard is a very strong message that if you are a relative wanting to see a loved one in a care home, particularly where that loved one is dependent on the contact with the family, and that's exacerbated, I suppose, where the resident has dementia. What's been said to us in the inquiry is that those who are coming in and wanting to see people in the care home are going to deliberately take precautions, such as whatever infection control precautions they need to take, and I would have thought head towards vaccines as well. Would you see it being necessary not merely for people coming, staff coming into the care homes, but also the loved ones of residents coming into care homes?
Yeah, like many people in the room and who will watch this video, I had online. I mean, my father was in a care home and had dementia during the pandemic. So many of us have been through that experience. I suppose one additional question to add to that is that whether there are obligations not only to the relative you're visiting, but also to the other people in the care home. Yes. And given what we knew about staff moving between care homes, potentially responsibilities to people in other care homes too. I think those are important considerations. I also think, and this is about vaccines, but of course there are questions about lockdown to do, the impact of lockdowns and the impacts of restrictions on people with dementia, and some of them medical, possibly to do with dementia itself, but some of them to do with the impacts of lack of social contact. Yes. I think one thing we've talked about here is employers and kind of requirements, as it were. But I also think it's important to pay attention to personal moral responsibility. Mm-hmm. So as a relative, I felt I felt, and I think it would be reasonable to say that people ought to get vaccinated if there's good evidence that this will put their relatives at risk and other people's relatives at risk. But that doesn't necessarily mean there should be a rule, as it were, about it.
Professor Wilson, do you have any comments to make in particular in relation to the specific that I put about principled objection, but generally, do you have any comments to make about the question that goes beyond what you've already said in your written response?
When you asked the initial question, you asked both about vaccination and test and trace, and I noticed we hadn't discussed test and trace at all, so I thought I might say one or two elements about that. So it struck me as actually quite reasonable for a government to require that people, if they have the symptoms, do test themselves, and if they test positive or negative, that the results are uploaded to a central system which allows the data to be collected and some idea of the progress of the pandemic to be plotted in order to help strategy. And that poses certain obligations on citizens, as it were, to partake in that, upload your information. Not only that, but obligations, assuming that's part of the system, that you be willing to comply with contact tracing, and so that could potentially seem intrusive to people. You could imagine if somebody said, "Well, who have you had contact with in the last few days? We need a list of those, and we may need to then contact them and see who they've had contact with." And certainly, someone who was very concerned about their privacy might want to object to that. But it seems a case where the public interest is so overwhelming in being able to sort of trace down the cases when that's still possible and ask people to self-isolate, that I think it's sort of fairly easily overcome. And so that maybe my thought about the pandemic more generally is that there's, in the context of a public health emergency, what would usually be sort of the boundaries of personal kind of privacy and the ability to control information of yourself need to be weakened somewhat in order to allow a proper public health defence to be put in place. And that maybe one thought, given that we spent so long yesterday talking about lockdown, it seems that there's a variety of ways in which we can control the vectors of disease and help us help stop us from getting a position where lockdown might become necessary, and that some of those will require a degree of handing over of privacy or allowing sort of further access to information or restricting your behaviour in certain other ways, much short of what a lockdown would require. And so that yes, I think that those a lot of those elements are justifiable in the context of a public health emergency.
Thank you. Professor Miles, can I come to you particularly in relation to the specific need of having a vaccine passport or having some indication that one has been vaccinated when it comes into the when it's factored into the employment situation? Do you have any comments to make in relation to that?
Well, I very much agree with what's been said already, and it's this is just one more example where certain values or rights that we might all accept that people have can conflict one another, and how you resolve that conflict, sort of morally or ethically, depends to a large extent on the very specifics of the situation. I think in a situation where vaccines are highly reliable and where the costs of the virus spreading are very high, and they may be particularly high in certain areas, then I don't think there should be a sort of general moral objection to, in certain cases, vaccines being obligatory for people to do certain other things, travel, work in a certain area. I mean, there is a difficulty with drawing analogies, and I completely understand the analogies. There are certain jobs where we just insist that people have to do certain things, and it's clear from the outset. You have to wear a hard hat if you're going to work on a construction site. You have to wash your hands if you're going to handle uncooked meat. And there's a bit of a difference between a situation where that's well understood and known from the outset, and people who just find it difficult to live with that would just find work somewhere else, and a different situation which you're faced with during a pandemic, where someone's settled in some role and then you rather suddenly introduce a restriction. And I think, in some sense, the threshold for introducing an absolute requirement there should be higher than where it's clear from the outset that if you're going to work in this industry and do this kind of job, you need to, wear the hat, wash your hands. But that doesn't mean that there aren't circumstances where you should have obligations, and some people will find them very difficult to conform with, and ultimately they may not be able to play the role then, and that seems a perfectly reasonable thing to introduce.
Thank you. Lord Sumption, I think we know from your written response that you don't see any particular ethical difficulty in vaccine passports. Is there anything further you would like to say, given the specific concern that I've indicated?
My view is, I think, very similar to that which has been expressed by those who've gone before me. I mean, I agree with what's been said about that. I think it may assist if I just say a little more about the human rights angle. Potentially, a ban on the employment in some areas of people who have not been vaccinated might engage Article 8, right of privacy. It might engage Article 10, freedom of expression. It probably does engage Article 14, discrimination in the exercise of other rights. In all three contexts, it seems to me that the question is going to depend, first of all, on whether there is an objective justification, i.e. whether the risk of transmitting the virus to potentially vulnerable people is sufficiently great to justify that kind of measure. I'm aware that vaccines do not totally prevent transmission. On the other hand, as I understand it, and you'll have had you received your own evidence on this subject, those who have been vaccinated, if they do transmit the pathogen, it has a much lower viral load, with the result that there is still a significant improvement consequent on vaccination, even if it isn't a total cure. So the first question is whether there's an objective justification in that sense. Secondly, it depends on whether there is an alternative which is less intrusive, which could achieve substantially the same benefits, the obvious potential alternative being frequent testing. Thirdly, I suppose it depends on whether the consequence of such a policy might be the impossibility of retaining qualified staff that are also essential to the performance of the service. I would originally once have thought that this was a rather remote possibility, but it seemed less remote, certainly in England, when an attempt was in fact made in the later stages of the pandemic to require doctors in the NHS to have been vaccinated, and a sufficiently large number of doctors objected and said that they would rather leave the service for the government to back down on that. So that obviously is a real subject of concern. As regards other contexts in which a vaccine passport might be used, like access to nightclubs and travel facilities, I think that's a much easier question, because these are voluntary activities, so that the requirement of a vaccination is not coercive in the same way as it is if you make it a condition of the employment of a specialised person. So I have much less difficulty in that context.
Thank you very much. Professor Kearney, can we look at this from the perspective of possible government decision-making? Do you see a role for government in this context?
Yes. I mean, I think probably the biggest issue is, well, in normal times, you know how governments will legitimise their decisions. They tell the public in advance what their plans are. They're elected, and then they carry out the manifesto. Say, here, this is clearly a case in which almost every choice they have made, no one has anticipated. So they don't have the usual means to legitimise their decisions routinely. So I think the question then would be, how do they do it under those circumstances? The obvious one would be to pass legislation that was legitimised by at least one parliament. And that raises some issues here in terms of the devolved context, because some of the legislation was produced by, in fact, I would say most of the relevant legislation we're talking about would be produced by Westminster, and some of them the Scottish Parliament. And so it presents a means for Westminster to legitimise decisions made by the UK government on behalf of the Scottish government, and for the Scottish Parliament to play quite a limited role in scrutinising the other stuff. Then the Scottish Parliament has this role in scrutinising secondary legislation. But I think that's a notorious area for, very few people pay attention to or understand secondary legislation, to the extent that it's difficult to say that you can produce much legitimacy through that route. And I know that was, so I know that MSPs have generally been stoical about that, saying, okay, we understand that these were unusual times and, we don't have much time. But I think it was an issue that people accepted at the time. But if you were thinking ahead, there must be a better way to process secondary legislation in a way that people feel satisfied that it received meaningful scrutiny and assent. I think that the same might be said for, if it's such a difference in expectations for citizens, you would expect some kind of routine consultation or engagement with people to inform those decisions. And I know there was some, but I think that's one of those issues where the question might be, how can we anticipate the need to gain widespread public consent for something in advance with a clearly defined process for the next time? Final two things. This came up with more with the UK, but there is a Scottish angle. There's a question about test and trace to the extent, should it be centralised or decentralised in terms of the governance, and who would provide the most legitimate role? So I think the UK government very much took the view that it should be centralised and new. Test trace system should be essentially established, whereas the criticism was there was already this obligation to have local public health capacity, and that it was ignored. So there are those kind of governance issues about who should be responsible. And then finally, it's difficult in the UK to know the extent to which the schemes we're talking about are to some extent voluntary. So I think if we were talking about, say, my understanding of the South Korean test, trace and isolate, it would be hard to describe that as voluntary, in that it's high state intervention, highly centralised, and then a very strongly enforced obligation to isolate, and that it's monitored. My impression of the UK is it very much was, there was a system to test, trace and isolate, but compared to other countries, it was much more in terms of we would encourage you to isolate, and I don't remember anyone really ever checking, or there was certainly no police or other state enforcement. So I think the question of human rights very much depends on the kind of model of providing these things that we think the UK or Scottish government are introducing. This seems like a relatively kind of liberal democracy type passport and test trace system compared to another country. So I think it would raise different human rights issues.
Thank you. Just picking up one thing you've said, as we go to another question further on, we'll come back, if we may, to the question of parliamentary scrutiny. So we will look at that again. Can I move on, please, to questions 4 and 5 in the questions that you've been asked? And a large part of this seems to me that we have addressed with you in discussion yesterday, and I think we can probably transpose what we've discussed yesterday and in relation to question 2 in particular, to questions 4 and 5. The one thing that I'm interested in is the reference in question 5 to the ensuring of measures, these are non-pharmaceutical interventions, are reasonable, proportionate, non-discriminatory. Now, I think we've done those. The ones that I'd like to just look at are temporary and prescribed by law. And I think to a certain extent we've probably done temporary, because I think round the table, and correct me, any of you, if I'm wrong, there is a consensus that it is desirable, at least, that when announcing, if one accepts that there is going to be a lockdown, or indeed any other non-pharmaceutical intervention, that it should be temporary in the extent that it infringes one's liberties. Can I just ask about the messaging in relation to temporary? There may be a danger, I suppose, that if one emphasizes that something is going to be temporary and subsequent events require it to be longer, or that it is changed, removed, and then reinstated, there may be a difficulty with ensuring, if this is what is necessary, compliance with that. Is that a concern in terms of both human rights and ethics? Professor Parker.
Getting used to going first. It's often not going to be possible to say when an intervention of any kind will end. I mean, we all hope these things are temporary, and we hope they'll be very short term. But the progress of the disease, new variants, etc., and other facts are likely to impact on when the end actually is. So I think it's important to specify at the beginning what might be thought of perhaps as the kind of stop conditions, the kind of principles that and criteria that will be taken into account and will inform the decision to end the intervention. And I think so this would apply to lockdowns, but it might also apply to something like the use of data in the contact tracing app. So we can't say it's going to end on the 5th of May, but these are the publicly stated criteria that we will use to and be held account to, with regard to, that we will use to inform that decision. So I think public reason giving, as we said yesterday, openness about the nuance and uncertainties involved, but a principled statement of the stop conditions, I think, is what can be what can be expected. One thing that I think is perhaps worth saying at this point is there's a tendency when talking about lockdowns to talk about the acceptability and appropriateness of the imposition of a lockdown. Very little has been said about the ethical and human rights, I guess, implications of lifting a lockdown. So it strikes me that there may well be there are likely to be different ways of ending a restriction. So you could, for example, allow children to go back to school, but not allow people to go back to work, or you could do different things, like as we did the kind of the size of groups that could meet. And the way one does that is going to have important implications that might have rights aspects. So, for example, if you open schools, or if you allow people to go back to work but don't open schools, that's going to affect women who have children or carers in different ways. So I think the ending of lockdowns actually is an under considered dimension of this space.
Okay. Can I just take one further point to you, Professor Parker? Is there a risk that if one has either a set end date or a slightly flexible end date for a restriction, and one adheres to that, either specifically or generally in terms of when it occurs, and then one requires to reinstate, is there an ethical dimension or an ethical concern as to particularly the confusion that may cause in the minds of the public, or not merely concern but perhaps doubt as to the accuracy of what they're being told?
Well, and over time, certainly if that's repeated, I remember the very early days of the pandemic, I was invited to a WHO meeting, and I sat next to someone who's an epidemiologist, and I said, nice to meet you, and he said, brace yourself, this is going to be 2 or 3 years. And he said, but he was someone who'd been involved in SARS in Toronto, so there was a sense this was going to go on for a very long time, and if that's the case, then stopping and starting things in ways that are give the false impression that we have more control than we actually do, and are kind of contrary to what's been said, are going to have the potential to undermine trust and undermine the effectiveness of future decisions. So trust and trustworthiness are important considerations here. I do think, potentially there may be an argument for saying we're only going to do this for, our aim is to do this for 2 months, say, and unless anything changes dramatically, we'll end it on that date. I can imagine something like that possibly working, but there would always be a need to caveat that, because the pandemics are unpredictable in many ways.
Would many of your objections be answered by a requirement to have a review after a given stated period of time, which is not uncommon in legislation and regulatory provisions?
I guess that's the way I would. Yeah. So the sort of public reason giving, I think, is absolutely vital, and that should be bringing in different perspectives. Yeah, I would imagine there needing to be a formal process and a public process about that. But I think there may be occasions where it's reasonable to say this is our aim. Our aim is not that this will be an open-ended intervention, whichever one we're talking about. And our aim is for this to be time limited, and these are the kind of principles we'll apply, and having some kind of process for doing that in a public way. Absolutely.
Okay. Professor Wilson, your observations on this, if I may, particularly your observations on the temporary nature of a non-pharmaceutical intervention, and the need, as his lordship has said, for a process of review.
Indeed, I might start a little bit further back, because it strikes me that one of the features of a pandemic is always going to be that what's going to happen sort of in a month's time is going to be somewhat unpredictable. That there may be a new variant may come on stream. That happened repeatedly during the pandemic. We realised that plans that we'd made, which assumed that a certain level of effectiveness, that then had to be changed once you realise, there's been a mutation and the R number is now double what it previously was. So that my thought is that not only do you need regular review, but also you need to start as a government to create sort of expectation that there's some likelihood of change. You can sort of keep in play some overarching strategy, which will be the same, but effectively you need to be able to say, well, we're fighting against an enemy which itself is innovating in real time, and as the pathogen changes, we may need to change as well. And as a result of that, you need to create a sort of expectation that in the public that it's likely that there may be changes, although we know what it is that we need to do at the moment to keep the public safe, and we have a strategy that we think is effective to do that, and we'll keep that strategy under review. Don't be surprised or shocked if things turn out either better or worse than we had anticipated. That's just the nature of dealing with a virus that's self-mutating in real time.
Yes. Thank you. You very much anticipated what I was going to ask you further about that. You, I think, see a utility in making the population aware of the potential end date, but caveating that with a warning that that end date may be something that has to, I'll use the word mutate, in response to what is happening. Because I suppose if one goes back to COVID and the early days in which we didn't know really what we were dealing with, at least members of the public didn't know what we were dealing with, giving members of the public at least the hope that what is happening is only going to be temporary is an important, possibly an important factor.
No, I would certainly agree that giving people the hope and a realisation that the restrictions in place are temporary is really important. But I think it would be to create a false hope and just set yourself up as a government to kind of create all sorts of disappointed expectations. If you say, for example, that the lockdown, if you say in 2 months in advance the lockdown will end on the 23rd of March, and then if circumstances have changed, I think it would be an extraordinary dereliction of duty for the government to say, well, we promised that this will end on these days, but the circumstances have changed, so, but nonetheless we should end it. And I mean, maybe often in politics, maybe it's straying perhaps more into Professor Kearney's expertise, but it seems that sometimes there's worries about politicians being seen to make a U-turn, and they're worried about doing that. But I think it's in the circumstances we're in, it's one in which politicians need to be able to sort of given the latitude to perfectly say, well, this is what we thought would happen, but the virus has mutated or other things have changed, and as a result of that, the strategy or the plan needs to change. I mean, there's a great quote from John Maynard Keynes. He said, well, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? It seems that that's maybe what governments need to be able to articulate, that's what a good strategy requires, given the uncertainty and the changing nature of the pathogen.
I think, and come to all of you to make comment on this, but I think what's coming across from the discussion, both yesterday and today, is the need for intelligent communication from decision makers, from government, which gives the population a clear indication of the various options, the various possibly consequences, and just give an anecdote. I was speaking to a friend last night who had been watching our proceedings yesterday, and she said to me, I really wish I'd heard all this 5 years ago. And I thought that was quite interesting that from somebody who had heard what we were discussing yesterday and compare and contrast, I suppose, to what did or didn't happen 5 years ago. Would you think that's an astute observation?
It does seem to be an astute observation. I was thinking about this partly in response to some of the questions we'll come to this afternoon about what more could governments have done by way of having some of these debates in public or doing more by way of public education. And it struck me that there's a job of work that governments together with their scientific advisors need to do, almost bring the public along with them about changes in understanding. So that I thought that there were opportunities to do that, to maybe to showcase some unfolding scientific findings which might be relevant. So, for example, some of the data unfolding, particularly via the King's College London's Zoe app, even from very early on, suggested that loss of sense of smell was an important symptom. It's something that you could have talked about the government, say, well, this is coming from, have a scientist talking about that, what it would mean, how it might work. You could imagine people might have discussed it in their families. Maybe somebody has lost their sense of smell, and it turned out to be one of the early symptoms. It happens asymptomatic. That's a information that would be very useful to be able to get into the public domain, discuss it even before you put it on your official list of symptoms. So it seemed that there were all sorts of opportunities for public education to provide ways of giving people tools with which to think better about sort of understanding kind of the vectors of the disease, how they might know whether they or the family member has it, and so on. And I think we could definitely do better at that, both on the science and maybe I think also thinking about the values as well. Certainly it's something to learn for next time.
Okay. Professor Busby, do you have any, I'm not going to insist on a yes or no answer, do you have any further comment in relation to temporary? But I think I'm particularly interested in what you may have to say in relation to the need for the restrictions to be prescribed by law.
Yes, so human rights principles would dictate to some extent that the use of mandates such as vaccine passports, track and trace systems which use personal data should be exercised obviously with great caution, and we need to ensure the appropriate and correct use and storage of the data collected. So there is an issue there, which is to do with privacy. And again, if we're looking at the sort of how that maps on, if you like, to the legal landscape, Article 8 rights might be appropriate there. So we need adequate safeguards in place to minimise the impact on individual rights, such as privacy. And to ensure that the principle of equality is observed in those systems and the way that they're used. And then we have obviously we've spoken about it already, but the principle of proportionality. So the use of surveillance tools, even in health emergencies, this is where the temporary nature comes in, must be proportionate and shown to be strictly necessary on the basis of the evidence. And that would mean that dictates that they must be temporary. But the issue of necessity, I think, is important here, and this comes back to what's already been said about the use of intelligence and the use of review, of course. So what's necessary, when's it necessary, how long will it be necessary for? These are all matters which are potentially unknown at the beginning of this process, but might be easier to deal with a degree of certainty as things unfold, but certainly open to the notion of review. So with all of that in mind, and thinking about the human rights considerations, I think large-scale data collection tools that do not identify individuals are capable of meeting these requirements, for sure. So I wouldn't think there's any human rights objection to them, but they should be temporary, and of course we have to take into account the use of that data and the destruction of the data when it's no longer necessary to fulfil the purpose for which it is collected. So those safeguards need to be built into any system that we have to ensure human rights compliance, but it doesn't mean that you can't do these things if they are necessary.
Okay. Just on the question of prescription by law, and this perhaps goes on to another question that we will address. I suppose one asks, well, how is something like this going to be prescribed by law? And would I be right in suggesting to you that it would be desirable, if one is looking to it being prescribed by law, that whatever law does prescribe it is framed in exact and certain terms?
Yes, I think that is important, but again, as his lordship has said, subject to a process, a system of review. So I think, yeah, you have to look at ways of legislating, using regulation, using the powers that Parliament has, but and building into that regulation as much certainty as you can, so that there is clarity there. We need to pay attention to legal certainty, for example, and important principles there in terms of lawmaking. But yeah, always with the door open to future review and an outline process, perhaps. Included in the legislation for that. What form will the review take, and so on. So yes, I think as much certainty as we can would really be important in the regulation.
particularly where that regulation is derogating from what may be seen to be a fundamental right.
Absolutely, yeah.
Professor Miles, on this this particular subject, from your perspective, is it important, so far as the public are concerned, and particularly I'm thinking here of the employed public, to have a knowledge that whatever the restriction is going to be temporary?
Well, I mean, knowledge, if one means that certainty, I think that's asking too much, because any restriction, particularly the most extreme restrictions, decisions about when and how they're lifted must be conditional on the evidence and how things are playing out. You can't know that in advance. I think it's very helpful, though, that people should receive the message that the great hope is, and perhaps the likelihood is, that really restrictive measures are temporary. And the reason that they're temporary are that there's an understanding by the government that they are very costly. I think that's a message that people need to hear, that there is that understanding that restrictions need to be proportionate and that the government is aware of very difficult trade-offs. And that decisions on when restrictions are eased or perhaps reintroduced are not arbitrary. They do depend on the evolution of the risks in the virus and how it's spreading, and how effective alternatives are. And spelling that out is helpful, just to avoid the view that the government's flailing around. It's introducing one thing 1 week, then 2 weeks later it changes. It's all arbitrary. Why should we comply with this stuff? They don't know what they're doing.
Well, Sumption, your views on the advisability of, or the necessity of, restrictions being, and then we're aware of your views as to the generality of lockdown, but if there is lockdown, as the NPI, your views on it being temporary and the necessary prescription by law?
Right. Well, I mean, I think the first aspect that one needs to address is the human rights aspect. It is clear from the case law of the Strasbourg court, I mean, I'm thinking in particular of cases about quarantine, like Enhorn and Sweden, that a restriction of indefinite duration is more difficult to justify than one which has a definite duration. Now, I quite understand the difficulties in the way of putting a definite term on any of these things, but I think one has to recognize that the legal cost that you have to pay for that uncertainty is a greater burden of justification. Secondly, I think there is a wider implication as far as messaging is concerned, which is that the expected duration of the pandemic may significantly affect what NPIs you think it is appropriate to have. I suspect that most people, when the first lockdown was announced, assumed, without actually being told, that it would be short-lived, a temporary measure to smooth peak demand on hospitals and so on. I think that it's very likely, though this is to some extent speculative, that if people had been told that the pandemic would last until a reliable vaccine came into existence, which was likely to be at least 18 months or 2 years and could well be significantly longer, that would have caused them to review the likely cost of, e.g., lockdowns, and would have meant that there was much greater scrutiny and much greater potential opposition to the notion of having a lockdown. As it was, the duration of the pandemic was something that I think crept up on the public too gradually for them ever to have sat down and said, how long are we in this for? What are the likely costs? Because if we're talking about 6 or 8 weeks, well, that's very manageable. But if we're talking about 2 years, we need to rethink this from scratch. So I think that there is actually a very significant point which goes beyond just messaging. It goes to the heart of decision-making and as well as the explanation of decisions. As far as prescription by law is concerned, I don't think that this is a distinct problem. I think there is a problem about prescription by law, but it's a completely different one, concerned with the issue of guidance, which is at variance with the terms of statutory instruments and the conduct of the police in making certain assumptions about the law which were unjustified. But I think that's a completely separate issue, and I suspect you'd probably prefer me to address that at some other point.
I think there's a direct question for you on that, so
yes.
We'll come to that later. Thank you very much. Professor Kearney, looking at this from the policymaker, the decision maker's perspective, and you can probably reflect on what was done. Concerns that the policymaker and decision maker may have in providing an indication of temporary and perhaps as general and as unspecific as that, and then having to bring to the table subsequently bad news that temporary expectation, which is what Samson has just said, may just be a few weeks, is actually going to be longer. That is a problem, I think, for decision makers.
Yeah. So it's already enough of a problem in the way you described. I think it becomes a mess when you consider that the answer to the question, should you have a definite date or a conditional approach? The answer could well be both in the UK. In fact, the UK government seemed to go for a date-based approach, saying, okay, we've got to give you hope. Okay, you can endure. The Scottish government favoured much more of a, we will relax restrictions when we meet certain criteria. And the combination could be okay if they were completely separate jurisdictions, but they weren't. So, for example, I'm sure the Scottish government will say this, their lockdown measures were heavily contingent on the UK governments because they had to be financed. So the UK government would essentially only finance the measures that it took, not any additional measures that the Scottish government would take. So the Scottish government could describe a series of principles to use, but they would not be the only considerations they could use under those circumstances. The other thing was I reminded myself, a brief thing is we've been talking about how to communicate these things. The lockdown measures themselves, I think, were readily communicated in stark terms. So we talked about whether or not they were expressed well, but they were clear. The lockdown release communication was fantastically complicated to the extent when I did a previous report, I found it very difficult to actually just provide a summary account of what each government said they would do and when. But the other thing would be the principles themselves. I was looking at the Scottish government explicitly said we will use the World Health Organization's 6 criteria for easing restrictions. And I was looking at those criteria, and they all seem very sensible, reasonable principles. But then when I look at them, it's hard to know if you could ever know if any of them are met. So, for example, the first one, evidence shows that the COVID-19 transmission is controlled. Now, I think what happened was, in reality, there were lots of different transmissions at different times, and no one ever really got a sense that they were in control or not. Or at least they did it in May 24th, and then they didn't, 25th. Sufficient public health and health systems capacities are in place to test, trace and isolate, and to quarantine contacts. Now, I think given the way the UK and the Scottish Government did that, I don't think they had enough data to be able to say what was sufficient and when. Outbreak risks are minimised in high vulnerability settings. Number 4 is preventive measures in workplaces are sufficient. Number 5, manage the risk of exporting and importing cases from high-risk areas. And the 6th one is particularly tricky. Communities have a voice, are informed, engaged and participatory in the transition. That sounds like an excellent principle. I have no idea how you could say we have met this condition, therefore we take the release. So if you're talking about certainty, a date gives you that false certainty. Conditions give you, I think, they build in uncertainty. They essentially say to people, we don't know when we're going to release, but we will use our judgment will be based on these factors.
And I suppose that brings us to, as we will come to much further on, I suppose, trust in decision makers.
Yeah.
Thank you. Could I just move on now to alternative NPIs? And without going through all of them in detail, because a lot of them we've looked at yesterday, the one that I'm particularly interested in is the targeting of the most clinically vulnerable. And again, I think we're probably at one around the table that it would be advisable at least to have what I termed a bank of knowledge to inform policymakers as to who are the most clinically vulnerable, and possibly the most clinically vulnerable in relation to a variety of potential pandemics. And obviously that may be difficult, but presumably it can be done. The concern that there may be if one targets restrictions in the way that reflect either the most clinically vulnerable or, for example, particular geographic locations, whether they be urban or rural. And I'm interested particularly to have your views on the possibility of those differences creating a certain degree of public resentment. I can see my granny in Orkney, but I can't see my granny in the Glasgow Conurbation. Is that a concern? Professor Parker, can start with you again.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is just stepping back one point. One thing we're talking about is the responsibilities of governments in relation to, and other bodies in relation to imposing restrictions. I think we haven't said enough, and there hasn't been enough discussion about what governments can do to encourage or enable people who, to behave in ways that are responsible. Not everything has to be achieved through a law or through an intervention. Some things can be achieved through, as Professor Miles was saying, by encouraging people to think carefully about their behaviour and to acknowledge and take account of their own responsibilities, the things that they can do. So, and governments have a role to play, I think, in enabling that to happen and reminding people of that, without, of course, being too much of a sort of. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but could we summarise that as informed, gentle persuasion?
I think one has to be very careful about the way in which this is done. So there are some ways which can come across as sort of preachy in a negative way. Condescending or patronising, or in a whole range of. So one needs to be careful about that. But nonetheless, it is, I think, a part at least of the responsibilities of those who are in decision-making roles and public, publicly kind of visible, to raise the question of what we as individuals and families and people in relationships might want to think about in terms of our own responsibilities and the way we manage our own behaviour. So I think that's, and that might be not doing things, not visiting people. It might be about being vaccinated, or it might be about sharing our data. It might be about participating in research. There could be a whole range of ways in which that might arise. But I think that has to be done very, very carefully. And my preference would be something fairly low-key but effective, so evidence-based. So that's one thing I think is important. I think the second question was about targeting of. So, and I perhaps later we'll come on to other questions. But my hope is that, without going too far with this, that our responses to future pandemics will be more intelligent. They'll be informed by the experience of this one, but also potentially by the uses of digital tools and greater knowledge sharing and those kind of things. So my hope is that they could potentially be more intelligent, which raises then the question about what does intelligent mean? And in some ways, intelligent will mean calibrating, a bit like a sort of music sound mixing. Sometimes the volume goes up and sometimes it goes down. And there'll be that aspect. But there'll also be a sense in which some places may need to be treated differently to others, which raises the question you're talking about. And targeting people could be thought of in two different ways. One is people are the target of the requirement to behave in a certain kind of way, possibly. And the other would be targeted in terms of being the primary concern, and that might involve other people's movements being restricted. So one needs to pay attention to both of those. Your point about resentment, I think there are ways in which, it's quite an old-fashioned view maybe, I think there are ways in which one can feel unhappy about what one has to do, and to some resentment may not be the right word, but seriously unhappy about what one might have to do, but nonetheless recognise that it's the right thing to do and that the decision has been made in a way that's reasonable and accountable, and so on. There are lots of things, that we all have to do that we'd rather not do, So I think resentment is genuine resentment, or justified resentment possibly, is only something that can be avoided to some extent by transparency and by justification and by timeliness of the lifting of requirements.
Thank you.
That's perhaps.
Mr. Wilson.
So I wanted to say things on two elements of that. The first was about the idea of targeted NPIs, and there were one or two people within the bioethics literature who did sort of make the bold argument that you ought to have an age-specific lockdown, effectively say, well, if there's certain people who are at higher risk, then the lockdown should just apply to them, and that many people, including me, thought that seemed to be sort of ethically indefensible as a way of viewing things. It seemed to place a kind of double jeopardy on those who were already clinically highly vulnerable, and so that. And that maybe one of the points that Lord Sumption made yesterday, that it seems that if somebody knows that they're clinically highly vulnerable, then it seems that you can rely on them to take reasonable precautions just out of self-preservation. So the idea that it would be helpful to put in additional legal restrictions to apply just to those people who are clinically vulnerable seems I guess on the face of it, somewhat discriminatory, or at least it threatens to be. And so that, maybe one important point to take away is that there may be targeted measures that is useful to bring in to provide additional support for those who are identified as being particularly at risk or particularly vulnerable, whether it's sort of ensuring that they can get access to the shopping they need to provide sort of help and so on. That seems to be a really important aspect of any NPIs, to ensure that they don't have additionally bad effects on those who are already vulnerable. And so that, as it were, in one sense, targeted NPIs would terrible insofar as they create double jeopardy. But insofar as we use the targeting in a different way to provide additional help and support for those who need it, that seems to be an important part of what it would be for an NPI to be ethically justifiable. I wanted also to touch on the question of sort of resentment and different areas of the country receiving different policies. Now, I mean, it just seemed to me, as a matter of fact, there was quite a lot of resentment. Certainly in England at the time, there were between sort of northern cities who were sort of often sort of put into high tiers and effectively de facto lockdown for quite some time, often without, from their perspective, receiving the support they needed from government in terms of extra funding in order to support that. So that maybe another case, it looks structurally similar to the case where you apply a set of additional legal restrictions to individuals, but without providing them additional support. Effectively, if that's what it seems like to communities, effectively say, well, their liberty is being curtailed in certain sorts of ways, but no additional support or help has been provided in order to meet their daily needs and so on, then there is likely to be resentment, particularly if it seems that either other communities can go about their business more ordinarily, or when the big city is in trouble, then suddenly there's a lockdown and there's a furlough, and then people are and funding is available. So I think that there certainly were some perceptions of the rules being applied in a way that seemed unfair. That just seemed a bit a matter of fact. There's quite a lot of sort of press releases in it. There were the northern number of northern mayors did press conferences about this at the time. I think to a lesser extent did that happen in Scotland, but certainly you can see quite a number of press articles on that at the time. So it seemed like it was a real concern. As far as I could see, there hasn't been a lot of academic literature on this, but certainly there were a number of anecdotal reports. You could find scores of newspaper articles about it from the time.
Thank you. Professor Busby, I'm just going around the table now, but from a human rights perspective, are there concerns about targeted restrictions?
I mean, I agree with what's been said so far. As long as, I think, we rely and can rely on people to, by and large, do the right thing in terms of what needs to happen. So we're not really talking here about something, I don't think, which might easily be prescribed by law, to come back to the previous point. These are things that might require guidance, and I think we would have to think very carefully, following on from the point that was previously made, about things like risk assessments for equality impacts, for example, and the identification which would come through that of additional support needs if we are going to target specific clinically vulnerable populations and treat them in a different way, perhaps with variations on how we do that, dependent on geography and so on. So I think, subject to those sorts of caveats, it makes sense, perhaps, in some respects, to have that nuanced approach if it follows the knowledge. I mean, I think that this all has to rely, if we're going, and this comes to the point about public resentment, if we're going to take people with us in this endeavour, we have to make sure that it's done transparently and with proper accountability, and that things are explained. I think if things are explained to people, as we've heard from the previous panel members, generally they will do the right thing. I think we have to make sure that these measures don't look punitive. I think that's really important, so that we preserve people's sense of fairness and they don't feel we're being punished for something that's happened that was maybe without our control. That would be an important consideration, but other than that.
I'm interested just in one word you used in that answer, accountability. Who's accountable?
All of us. We're all accountable in this sort of circumstance. Yeah, and I think that comes back to the point about, generally, with proper explanation, with proper understanding, with the information made available in a transparent way, people will do the right thing. So, yeah, we are accountable as a community, I would say. There's community accountability there.
Well, it's time for a break.
Time for tea. Very good. We'll take a break, come back at 11 o'clock. Thank you. you, Mr. Gill.
Thank you, my lord. Can we, given that we have only until midday, could we move to question 10, if I may? And I'm not ignoring your respective views on the questions that we're passing over, and we have a number of what we term Rule 9 questions, which raise certain of the issues that are considered in questions 6 to 9. But if I could move to question 10, which is the need to maintain a human rights-based approach to proactively seek to protect the rights of the population with particular regard to the most vulnerable in society and the maintenance of such an approach. Now, Professor Kearney, I'll break the practice of... I'm sorry, question 11. Yeah, beg your pardon. Can I go to Professor Kearney to begin with, looking at this from the perspective of a government decision maker? One of the things we've heard about have been impact assessments. For a decision maker, how difficult is that to do?
Well, I mean, the short answer is profoundly difficult. The longer answer is they have a series of measures built into systems to make routine impact assessments, such as equality impact assessments, and to some extent health impact statements. There's always been this question, I think, generally in government about are these tick box exercises? I guess you would get that a lot here. That certainly there's a requirement to fill in a form and to signal that you've thought about these issues. Whether or not you have the ability to do that properly is another matter. Okay, that's also a short answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, tick box exercises we've heard mentioned quite a lot in this inquiry, as you might imagine. The general context in which those comments have been made, and I mean no disrespect to those who have made them, because they're made very well, is that it's very easy to do, and it can be done, and the decision maker can say we've done it, and there it is, without perhaps the level of scrutiny that one would wish. Would that be correct in thinking?
I think so. Certainly, in terms of some of the considerations, if we go back to that question of how you actually measure the equalities impact of something, you can fill in a form quite easily in terms of I have considered these issues during a legislative process, or I have attended to issues of discrimination, for example. It is more difficult to then say in advance what will be the outcome-based inequalities, and that is more about continuous assessment. That would be, so that I think that's more of a commitment to continuous assessment over a certain period of time. I mean, I think you could make a commitment to, I mean, it sounds pejorative, but to fill out the same form more than once and keep updating it and reflecting on it. You know, it could be a good exercise, and the obligation to do it could be a good thing if done well. I mean, I think a lot of that comes down to this is trust in good people doing the right thing with whatever system they have. I think it's a bit different with, say, financial accountability, where there are different rules and expectations for being held to account later for the choices you've made. It's difficult to hold people to account for the choices they've made with unequal outcomes that they didn't anticipate. I think with finance, you're expected to anticipate them. With inequalities, I think you are maybe given more leeway to, for things not to work out the way you'd hoped.
And can I move on slightly, and I'll use this question, a combination of these two questions, as a vehicle to ask you about this. And that's the question of parliamentary scrutiny. We know from the way in which Parliament operated that parliamentary scrutiny had to be hastened in the context of making legislative provision during the pandemic. There may also be suggestions that parliamentary scrutiny was bypassed in the context of legislative scrutiny. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes. I think I'm disproportionately vexed by this. Partly because, I've studied Scottish politics for a long time, and we used to, if you teach Scottish politics, you start with this idea of new politics, that, a new dawn after devolution. The Scottish Parliament would be just so much better than the Westminster one. And I'd extended to its role in scrutiny, committees would be powerful and such like. And it obviously never lived up to those expectations. And I think we're in this period now where there's such limited attention to Parliament in terms of its effectiveness, to the extent that I think it can be damaging in this context to think it's not simply about the limitations to do with expediency. I think it's to do with limitations to do with expectations for the Parliament more generally. So I would imagine if you had a way to get out kind of honest assessments, honest stories about the Parliament, you would get, for example, a Scottish Government statement that said, okay, we would like to give Parliament more time here, but we don't expect them to use it. For example, I've heard that kind of argument, just informally with people. If the Parliament had more resources for scrutiny, we don't think they would use them in that way. So why bother? So I think there's that issue in general. The other one is this multi-level system issue, which is you could have, for good reasons, the UK and devolved governments agree to take this so-called four nations approach that includes for Westminster to legislate on its behalf. And often that is sensible when you have devolved and reserved responsibilities. You don't want to take the chance of loopholes and challenges. But that means that the Scottish Parliament does not scrutinise that legislation at all until perhaps Scottish ministers are given the authority to act on its basis and produce secondary legislation that could to some extent be scrutinised by the Scottish Parliament. And then the Scottish Parliament will scrutinise another bill by the Scottish Government that kind of mops up all these other issues that are not covered by Westminster. So there's not like a holistic assessment. And so I think I mentioned that when committees have talked about this, they have been quite stoical in terms of, particularly in terms of delegated legislation. They try to balance this statement. We recognise that you were in a rush and it was an emergency, but it would be good next time to have a system where we felt it was a meaningful process of processing this guidance and legislation. And I think it was rare to get a sense in the Scottish Parliament that there was a time and resources for meaningful scrutiny of Scottish Government legislation.
Professor Busby, could I come to you next in relation to this, and in particular to the first part of this combined question about proactively seeking to protect the rights of the population with particular regard to the most vulnerable in society. How does a decision maker go about that in practical terms?
Yes, so it relates to some of what Professor Kearney has already mentioned. So I would say that if we're talking about awareness of vulnerability generally, not in times of a health emergency, but in general terms, there are processes which enable data collection and equality impact assessments of all decisions made by policymakers or listed public authorities, including governments. And those exist under the Public Sector Equality Duty, Section 149 of the Equality Act, and what we call in Scotland the Fairer Scotland Duty, which is a socio-economic duty, Section 1 of the Act. And these requirements, the Public Sector Equality Duty, focusing on that, requires public authorities and those discharging public functions to have due regard in their decision-making to the need to eliminate unlawful discrimination, advance equality of opportunity, and foster good relations. Now, I'm a great believer in these positive duties and their promise, but what I would say is that all the evaluations that we've seen of the public sector equality duty show that at the moment, because of the way it's implemented, it's actually quite a weak tool in enabling this to happen. So there are, as Professor Kearney has mentioned, there's lots of data available, but much of it arises in the context of these tick box exercises, and then it isn't acted on. So I've done research with public authorities on this and asked them what's the missing bit that is not enabling you to measure impact, which is the bit that seems to be missing from the process in terms of the data that you're collecting and the changes that you would like to and should be making on the basis of that data. And they say, we don't really know what to do with it. We collect the data, we spend lots of time, lots of resource doing the exercise of equality impact assessment, for example, but then we're not really sure what we're supposed to be measuring that against. We're not really sure what the data is for and how we can use it in a positive, proactive way to enact change. So there's a weakness there, I think, in the way that the public sector equality duty actually operates that could be resolved and should be resolved. I think it should be a stronger duty.
Can I?
Yes, of course.
Just cut across and forgive me. It could be improved, should be resolved. How?
Yeah. Okay, so what you're trying to achieve through these positive duties is self-regulation by those public authorities, local authorities and other organisations. And that's a good goal, and it's what should happen, and it would be the most effective way of ensuring that decisions are made at the most local level, at the point of service delivery, in the right way. But we don't really have a system that enables that. So it's actually quite a laissez-faire system of regulation under the Equality Act. And I think that comes about because the Equality Act is largely to do with individual complaints, to put it that way. So it's seen as, it operates in employment, education, and other contexts, and is seen as a way of individuals bringing complaints, sometimes through legal resolution, sometimes through legal processes, about things that have happened to them or things that they think will be resolved through a kind of legal process. So quite laissez-faire, this is party-party litigation, but when we come to PSED, it's actually doing quite a different thing from the rest of the Act. And I don't think that is properly built into the way in which it's implemented. So we could have a much clearer framework, for example, about what's meant to be achieved. Outcomes could be set and should be set, I think. And in Scotland, we have Scottish-specific duties which do require the collection and collation of certain statistical information relating to the protected characteristics, but there's no standard method for collecting this data. So the results are patchy, and there is little, if any, guidance about what you should do with the data once you've collected it. So that could all be tightened up and should be tightened up. There should be learning, there should be shared learning across public authorities about what does good look like, what is success, how do we measure success, what are good outcomes. And I think there is a role for the Scottish ministers to play here in imposing some kind of framework about, for their own purposes, an obligation to consider and use that data once it is collected, and that information, it might not just be data, it might be other forms of information, in a way that actually enables them to feed that into policy making. And I would say, this seems like an awful lot of work, but the work is being done. This is the sadness, really, I think, in a way, about the duty, is that the work is being done, lots of resources are being used, but it isn't effective in the way that it should and could be. So I would put the emphasis there.
Yeah, that I think you anticipated what I was going to ask you. That this might seem to be, ideally, a very onerous obligation on government to do this. But as you said, it's being done. Is it the final step that is necessary to turn that base of information into a positive impact into decision-making process and legislation?
Yes, so it needs to be joined up. You know, as I say, a proper framework needs to, I think, to be introduced, and more focus needs to be put on the outcomes that are to be achieved. But that can be done, and I think in terms of the public authorities themselves who are doing this work, they would say, and they have said to me, we are doing the work and we're very frustrated that actually we're not really achieving anything through this work, and we would like to achieve what we're supposed to be doing, but we're not sure what that is. So I think, yeah, it's the final step that needs to be taken to make the duty more effective and actually make it do what it was meant to do. And this would mean, of course, that in terms of legal processes, this is a way for people not to have to go to law, not to have to go through what can be traumatic, difficult, and sometimes disappointing processes. For those who get there, lots of people want to go to law and don't for lots of other reasons to do with access to justice and so on. But actually, if you're talking about the care that someone in a care home should be entitled to receive, you know, it shouldn't be something, I don't think, for the courts and tribunals to be concerned with. It should be something which is done through this kind of responsive, reactive mechanism, which we do actually have in law, but which at the moment isn't achieving what it should achieve. And I would add to that, you know, I mentioned yesterday that the Scottish Government is planning a whole raft of incorporation of UN treaties into Scots law, an ambitious and difficult thing to achieve. That will bring with it, I suspect, a whole lot of human rights duties imposed on public authorities. And I think before we do that, we should really look at PSED, why it's not working, how it could be better implemented, and how it would be, should and could be aligned with those human rights duties. Otherwise, I think we're making an already quite messy system even more messy and less effective in the long run.
Thank you. Thank you. Lord Sumption, could I come to you in relation to the matters under discussion and focus, if I may, on two things which I, having read what you've said in your books and heard you today, I think you're interested in and have a particular view on. One is, I think you've called it ministerial decrees, and the use of ministerial decrees rather than parliamentary process. And the other is the movement from the words of legislation, whether it be primary or secondary, into guidance, which is something that this inquiry has heard a great deal about, and the difficulties, particularly for those who, I'll take the example of those who had loved ones in care homes, the difficulties that they had in understanding a rapidly changing system of guidance, and also the difficulties that presented to those who were caring for their relatives within care homes. So against that general background, could I ask you for your views?
The legislation conferred on the government, both the UK government and the Scottish government, extreme and intrusive powers. It seems to me that the more, the greater the powers that are conferred upon ministers, the more important it is that there should be some external scrutiny of the way in which those powers are exercised. That was made extremely difficult by the choice of the legislation used, and by the speed at which the relevant orders were amended or scrapped. Both the Civil Contingencies Act and the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984 provide for parliamentary scrutiny, and it seems to me that Parliament is the fundamental way in which any democracy is going to limit and control the exercise of executive powers. The vehicle chosen was the Public Health Act, which has less effective provisions for scrutiny and much longer timetables before it provides that the orders have to be approved within what is in fact quite a long period of time, particularly as it excludes periods when, for example, Parliament was not sitting. That in practice meant that by the time parliamentary approval was changed, very often the order in question had been radically amended or replaced by a different order, which had in turn started another period of time to run. And that profoundly undermined the whole process of parliamentary scrutiny. I think that that was unfortunate, and it probably needs legislative attention before we go into this kind of problem again. As to the best way of scrutinizing it, I think that votes in Parliament confirming an order may not be the most effective way of dealing with this. Experience suggests that discussions in Parliament, in the whole of Parliament, are much more partisan. It's one of the unfortunate features of this whole issue that the issue of NPIs became politicized, although there is actually no rational reason why decisions about, for example, lockdowns can be informed by the classic division between left and right. It seems to me to be totally irrelevant to the kind of issue which they're concerned with. But the fact is it was politicized, and that made the general body of Parliament a much less appropriate forum in which to conduct scrutiny. It's the reason why I think that both in Scotland and at Westminster, there should be a dedicated parliamentary committee responsible for the scrutiny of these altogether exceptional powers. I think that this would not necessarily require an enormous expenditure of resources. It would require a committee to have power to summon witnesses, to form its own view on a more or less continuous basis about what the government was doing legislatively and in practice, and to report regularly to the full Parliament about what it considered was going wrong, if anything, and what should be done about it. It seems to me that that is asking a lot of parliamentarians, but it is asking no more than the onerous nature of their public responsibilities requires of them. As far as the other point that you raise, guidance and so on, that I think is a separate issue, and it raises questions about whether the way in which the measures were in practice applied conformed to the rule of law and were, in human rights terms, prescribed by law. Certainly, UK ministers, and I think to some, though to a lesser extent, Scottish ministers, were inclined to give guidance about the meaning of legislation, secondary legislation, which was very much at variance with the text of the legislation. The difference wasn't as great in Scotland as it was in England, because in some respects the Scottish regulations were tougher than the English ones, so that the tougher guidance was a bit closer to what the legislation actually said. But there were differences, I think, in both countries. It seems to me that for ministers to give guidance as to what people should do is perfectly legitimate, provided they make it absolutely clear, which they did not, that this was guidance as to how people should conduct themselves, rather than a statement as to what the law required of them. And I think that that was a grave dereliction of duty, primarily, I think, by the British ministers, but I think that to some extent the Scots could learn from that also. There was a separate problem about the way in which the police interpreted their powers. A lot of policemen and police commissioners said, well, our job is to ensure that this pandemic is brought under control. Their job was not to ensure that the pandemic was brought under control. Their job was to enforce whatever laws the government, in its exercise of secondary legislative powers, thought fit to make. It seems to me that the police need much clearer information about exactly what their powers are and what the public are and cannot be required to do. Certainly in England, the position was transformed when, after quite a number of weeks, the ACPO produced a single-page document which every constable was then given, which explained what those limits were, and that made a very big and very rapid difference to the way that the police behaved. I do not know whether a similar arrangement was made in Scotland, but it was certainly something that should have been made at the outset.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Parker, Professor Wilson, I don't necessarily expect you to speak with one voice, but
in unison.
I'm interested to know if we're looking at a real-world policy making and the human rights-based approach. Let's translate that to ethical approach. How do you feel the real-world policy making could be improved by an increased presence of ethicists in it?
Well, I'll be brief, so I'll have more to say than me. Yeah, I think we've heard a lot in sort of previous contributions about the importance of gathering evidence, gathering information, so assessments of various kinds, and the challenges with doing those, and the contribution, the importance of regular review and of democratic processes. So I won't say anything about those, but to return to a bit of the conversation yesterday, there are important value questions at stake in achieving these goals. So we've got used to the idea of saying we can't follow the science. Science is valuable, but then judgments need to be made. I think the same thing is true of social science data. We'll learn things about who's impacted and in what different ways, and that will provide us with useful information. We can't simply read off from that what to do, because judgments still need to be made. So an important question then will be what kinds of expertise ought to be in the room when those decisions are made, to ensure that they take into account all relevant considerations and the process is a reasonable one and appropriately serious and structured. So some of those voices in the room will need to be voices of experience, as it were, people from a diverse range of circumstances, but others will be different kinds of expertise. I think personally there's a role for historians, sort of historians of infectious diseases, for example. I think those are important voices. But and this is not to sort of call for the job creation scheme for ethicists, but nonetheless, I do think people with ethics expertise ought to be in the room, not to say what should happen. That might be appropriate depending on where they are. So I would argue that there ought to be ethics expertise on the kind of committee that Lord Sumption just called for. And there might be a role for that person to actually have some normative input, as it were, to say what ought to happen. But more broadly, I think just to ensure that relevant considerations are taken in, value considerations are taken into account, there ought to be ethics expertise in many of these rooms.
Thank you. Professor Wilson.
So I think in order to do better on the kind of public ethical deliberation that's required, I think you actually need much deeper expertise and training for people in ethics across government, maybe in the civil service as well, because otherwise it seems that you run the risk of doing the ethics equivalent of tick boxing, that even if you have an ethics framework, a pandemic ethics framework, as we heard it wasn't really particularly used, or a framework like the 4 harms that we heard of yesterday. Unless people, as it were, have some sense of the ethical values animating them, the sorts of trade-offs between them that might be required, and how one might go about sort of creatively thinking about how to balance them, then you may end up with a tick box exercise where somebody says, well, we've looked at the framework, but it doesn't really help you make sounder, more justifiable decisions. And so I think there's a role at sort of high-level committees, whether to have ethicists on something like SAGE or to have them involved in other committees as well. But maybe it's something I'm struck by as I meet sort of civil servants and others who work in government. The people's sort of level of sort of understanding of ethics, ethical theories, ethical reasoning, how it can help them, it's not always that high. And so I think there's a job of work there, just in the same way as you saw that with the coming of a human rights culture or the public sector equality duty, it's taken some time to think about, well, how do we use this to actually improve practice? I think that there's maybe a similar set of conversations to take place over the next few years about, well, how would we effectively sort of mainstream ethical expertise, improved ethical deliberation, and put it at the heart of government decision making, for whether for future pandemics or just more generally in thinking about the sort of questions that governments need to take systematically, which involve ethical trade-offs.
I suppose everything is case specific, but would that input, which I understand you saying would require a level of education, further education into in regard to decision makers, whether at ministerial level or civil service level, would that bringing that voice into the room, should that be something which is prescribed rather than being, if I could put it this way, optional?
I mean, I would have thought it would be helpful for the Scottish Government to have a thought about this insofar as they bring online a whole set of extra duties that come with incorporating the UN Human Rights Conventions. Insofar as you're incorporating the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CEDAW, or the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, you realise that you've acquired a set of rights, for example, the right of everyone to the highest attainable standard of health, and it requires you to progressively realise that with the maximum of your available resources. You realise that you'll have signed up to a set of cultural changes which require you to think quite hard about how you're going to progressively realise some quite ambitious goals, and that's going to require trade-offs. So to my mind, insofar as that the country as a whole is going to need to think quite hard about processes, duties placed on public sector bodies, I thought a greater attention to ethics and ethics expertise will be very helpful in trying to work out what that will mean in practice.
Mm-hmm. Professor Miles, could I turn to you? And looking again at this general question of how a human rights-based approach could help inform real-world policy making. From an economist's point of view, do you see a role for your discipline in that exercise?
Somewhat limited. I mean, economists like to quantify and measure things. Lots of the difficult issues that come up in the area that we've been talking about and responses to COVID are about different sorts of rights butting up against each other, which we've discussed many times. I suppose the contribution of economics, to the extent that there is one in this area, is in attempting to quantify the nature of the trade-offs between welfare benefits and and costs in one area or one group of people against those of another, some of whom will face costs far into the future and not today from actions that are taken today. And it's really in that area of quantification of trade-offs perhaps that economists can play some certainly limited role. If I can return to a question that we started out with a little while back, which was about the extent to which policymakers should be aware of disparities before ordering lockdown. If I could just make one observation on that. I mean, it seems to me that those disparities, certainly in terms of risk and serious health risks, were very clear very early on, that those risks were very different for people of different ages and people who already had certain underlying medical conditions. And because that was clear pretty early on, I think it meant that a policy which was a sort of blunt instrument, and I think lockdown was a relatively blunt instrument. After all, the key message was stay at home. Everybody stay at home. And I can see that there's a case for using a policy like that at a point of maximum uncertainty, maximum risk of catastrophic outcomes. But precisely because it didn't differentiate and it didn't take into account the very different risks to different groups of people, certainly by age, and also the different ability of people to comply with the rules and the different costs for different groups, I think it should have been used very, very sparingly, precisely because it was such a blunt instrument and generated very high costs, which didn't really differentiate between groups which clearly had very different risks.
Mr. Gill, can I?
Yes, certainly.
Earlier, when I referred to ACPO, the Association of Chief Police Officers, I should have referred to the College of Policing, which took over that particular function.
Thank you very much, Lord Subtitles. A very difficult question, which is the key challenges that government anticipate in implementing a new pandemic response framework. We, as an inquiry, have an obligation, obviously, to consider that. Briefly, can we go around the table and can you indicate what you see being the key challenges to a new pandemic response framework in the future? Professor Parker.
Not being a scientist, epidemiologist is a limit to what I can say, but I have two things, I think. One is, depending on when the next event happens, there is a bit of a worry, I think, as was said yesterday, that, the experience of this pandemic makes people more reluctant to do the things that are necessary next time. So I'm members of the public, as it were, in some way. So, there's a timing issue, and hopefully it won't happen for a long time. So that's one thing, I think. The other, but the most important thing, I think, is going to be the impact of digital tools of one kind or another, and that will pull in. Those will pull in different directions. They'll present a range of important ethical questions. I think an important one will be tensions between, as I mentioned yesterday, liberty and privacy, and these questions about when you can stop and start these things. So it's perfectly possible, I think, and the hope would be that digital tools, so enabling people to make more informed decisions about how they live their lives on a daily basis, where they go, as it were, would reduce and hopefully eliminate the need for lockdowns. Because people would be able to behave in ways that reduce risks based on their own informed judgment. That's unrealistic, but nonetheless the hope that more of that would happen. So there are strong ethical arguments, I think, in favour of trading off a bit of privacy to get more liberty, and that would reduce some of the harms on some of the vulnerable groups we've talked about. The downside, of course, is it's perfectly possible, as we've seen in, let's say, China, for example, and other places, for digital tools, one kind or another, to be used in overly restrictive and non-democratic ways. So there are problems and opportunities in both directions presented by those tools. I guess one thing was a problem earlier, I think, in the pandemic was there was a tendency, as Professor Koenig, I think, said, to say, well, the stuff they're doing in South Korea, in other places, they're not like us, and there are problems with that. Clearly, there are differences between our societies here and in Scotland and the rest of the UK and South Korea or China. But nonetheless, important lessons need to be learned internationally. There are things that we could have learned potentially. So, impacts of this experience on future, digital technologies pulling in different directions, and then the potential for international cooperation and learning, I think, are my three.
Just mention one point which we haven't directly addressed in this hearing, but we've heard a great deal about in this inquiry, and I imagine that at least some of us around this table for whom digital exclusion is probably an active concern, possibly something that we volunteer not to have. But so far as digital exclusion is concerned, we've heard that there are difficulties for people of a certain age. There are difficulties for people within certain socio-economic brackets. There are difficulties with people where English is not the first language, and there may obviously be translations and what have you to enable that to be understood. Is that just something we have to live with?
No, I think it's. So one thing I should add to my list of things, the key things to consider. I think we haven't mentioned anything here for obvious reasons because we've been focusing on Scotland, but our international obligations as a relatively rich country, I think, are really important for thinking about future pandemics. An important decision, for example, that was made by scientists developing the AstraZeneca vaccine, the scientists doing it, was they made a specific choice earlier in the development of that vaccine to say we want to develop one that's going to be usable in low middle income countries, so it's not going to require very high-tech freezer solutions. And I think that was they should, more credit should be given to them for that. There are costs associated with that, but nonetheless. So that's one thing. Our international obligations. The question about digital literacy or access, exclusion, I think, these are questions that ought to be addressed in similar ways to other kinds of exclusion, that work needs to be done to find creative ways to ensure that exclusion is minimized. Some of that will be about literacy and access to digital tools, but some of it might be about the ways in which the kinds of information that are relevant to, let's say, informed personal choice are distributed. So it doesn't necessarily have to go through an individual person's mobile phone. So one of the experiences I've had, for example, in my work in Africa, is the ways in which, so there's other health-related things, there's the ways in which people share mobile phones, or mobile phones can become sources of community knowledge rather than individual knowledge. So it may be that there are mechanisms that could be put in place to ensure that what's the sharing of information and information is not solely dependent on having your own phone and understanding it. That there are other resources around that to make it less of an obstacle.
The use of a community hub, perhaps.
Well, and yeah. And it will vary, I guess, and this needs to be based on evidence about we need an experimental approach to these, and there are lots of things we can learn in the interpandemic period. We shouldn't be waiting to learn these things. There are lots of other forms of health and other information that need to be distributed digitally, so we need to be thinking now about developing innovative ways of doing that.
Professor Wilson, the pandemic response framework. From your perspective, what do you see as the challenges to that?
One very general challenge seems to be maintaining the institutional memory and, as it were, maintaining the idea that it's a priority to be doing whatever is necessary to be planning for the next pandemic, not only to continue doing that for the next 3 or 4 years, but maybe for the next 5, 10, 20 years. It was a notable feature of the pandemic plans that we had, that we sort of had them, but were we rigorous enough about them? Had we taken sort of measures that could have been taken that would have allowed us to better control vectors of viral transmission, so that a lot of the work that was subsequently done, for example, on improving ventilation systems, as whether we could have done that already. Though the people knew in scientific terms how and why it was that sort of installing better filtration systems within the public buildings might have allowed you to slow the spread of any disease were it to happen. But there's work that hadn't done. So I think that maybe. In a way, this comes back to some of the points that Professor Miles has been making repeatedly. Think about, well, almost how much did the previous pandemic cost us? And then think about, given how much that cost us, how much we should be willing to invest now in order to prevent something nearly so bad happening in the future. My sense is in the past, pandemic planning has often been treated as less important, or is being funded only marginally. Whereas if you think that what we're trying to avoid spending is 200, 400 billion or whatever the price was, then you think that maybe we should be spending more on that. More specific thoughts about particularly any pandemic that's likely to happen in the next 5 years. I think we're in a much weaker position globally to respond to it than we previously were. You see that the US more or less pulling out the funding of USAID has had huge effects on the funding of global health research across the globe. The US now out of health organisation. There's a real question about sort of global health leadership, how that's going to happen. Should there be a pandemic in the near future? In addition to that, you see a variety of ways as a result of social media and other factors that there's much greater political polarisation than there was, and that were there to be a pandemic in the next year or so, it seems highly unlikely that the British government would be able to lean on sort of large social media companies, say we want you to control what we take to be disinformation being transmitted. So that it's highly likely that you're going to see a much greater sort of source and spread of disinformation, misinformation, should there be a pandemic in the near future. And I think that'll itself need to be something that governments take close into account in the way that they approach their communication, their messaging. I think it won't really be enough anymore to effectively sort of get either the Prime Minister or a scientist effectively speak almost ex cathedra, saying, well, I'm telling you the truth now. If there's a wide variety of voices in the public space and in the public sphere, and many of those which may be scientifically implausible are being amplified in various sorts of ways. So I think it's going to be an enormous communications challenge. I mean, my sense is the net effect of that is that it will be much more difficult to impose a lockdown and make a lockdown stick, even if it's something that looked like that it might be sensible in epidemiological terms. So as a result of that, if I was a government now, I'd be thinking very hard about, well, what are the sorts of things that we could put in place now which might allow us to better control the spread of any future pathogen without having to use severe NPIs. I mentioned, for example, ventilation systems as one of those, or maybe sort of thinking harder about a testing and tracing system, better disease surveillance, all these sorts of ways of effectively getting us to a position where we never have to pull that lever marked lockdown again, because we realise that were we to try and pull that lever next time, it might not go as we hoped.
Thank you. Professor Busby, from your perspective, what are the challenges to a future pandemic response framework?
I think the main challenge from my perspective is that ongoing challenge of the need to ensure or achieve a more equal society, which are lessons being learned from the experience of the last pandemic? I don't think so, not in the right ways. We need to overcome disparities. We've heard about them over the last 2 days, of how those measures that were introduced play out in both physical and psychological impacts for different groups of people, different individuals. We need to prepare now. We should be doing everything we can now to try and improve, at least, those disparities. In terms of digital exclusion, I agree with everything that's been said, but I'd add a couple of things. There's geographical Wi-Fi differences in distribution. So I don't think it's just to do with who has a mobile phone, who can use a mobile phone. I think we also need to make sure that, we have internet access widely available in all communities in Scotland, in all geographical areas in Scotland. And Also, in terms of digital exclusion, I'd add to the list of potential problems there accessible information. So people with learning disabilities might not be able to access information using digital methods in the same way that others can. And I think that kind of disparity needs to be thought through. And the final thing, I don't have the answer to this, but I'll put it out there anyway. I think a big challenge is going to be the public perceptions of government and regulatory means of dealing with this type of health emergency based on perceptions of what happened the last time. And I think that is going to be a huge challenge, actually, in terms of government's ability to act in future in this area.
Thank you very much. Professor Kearney, can I put the same question to you? What are the challenges from your perspective as a political scientist?
So I came up with quite a list. I'll try and remove the ones that you've heard so far. The first one was this unmet need for meaningful coordination and collaboration between different kinds of government, UK, devolved, local, and their cooperation with the wider public sector and essential people inside and outside the government. So I think a feature of perhaps the UK inquiry was that it's become already quite a blame game in terms of whose fault was it, and it was not really an exercise in trying to work out how to collaborate well. And I think that could well be a feature of the next crisis, quite easily. I should say often people will put that down to the parties or the personalities involved. So that's one thing. The other thing is the idea of integrating policy or policy making to make it coherent is a fantastically difficult thing, even with the best will in the world. You know, if you had energetic, sincere people who were driven to cooperate, you would still face problems. The second one would be confusion about what emergency to prepare for. And I know that was a phrase in terms of we'll prepare for the wrong pandemic, but I think there were two other things that are different. So one is, with the civil contingencies type language, I think the idea is let's prepare for a moment in time when everyone has to cooperate with each other really quickly. And that's an organisational kind of preparation question. The other is let's make sure the population is much healthier next time so that it's more resilient and more resistant to disease. And there are two completely different preparation exercises that, I mean, it's fine that they don't connect, but I think it's worth them being separate. The final one, I'll see, it's a big one, is my concern is that if you say to a government, next time you should adopt a series of excellent principles, they will jump at the chance to accept those recommendations because the Scottish Government is already very good at stating its high aspirations. I think the challenge is how does it translate them into something tangible? And I think there were two stages with colleagues. We talk about these three challenges. You know, so first is the lack of clarity. So it is useful for governments to not define any of these terms because their ambiguity helps. You know, to take a human rights approach when the Scottish Government says that, it sounds good, I think, and I think there's no real incentive to say what exactly it means. Then the second challenge is how to make it consistent with all the other things they do. And often when they clarify what they mean, they find that it contradicts existing government practices in a way that is much more challenging. And often that more routine government business wins out. And the third one would be capacity. So I think a lot of people talk about the need for, you know, political will or energy, that sort of thing. But I think there's this separate question about what capacity does the public sector have to do any of the things that governments require of them. And often that is more about reorganising how they do things rather than, you know, being sincere and energetic.
Professor Miles, your view on this?
A brief couple of observations from me. I think the question you put to us is how could future pandemic responses be better? I think there are two ways they might be better. The first is to pay greater attention to and try and factor in the change in behaviour from people voluntarily in the light of evolving information about what the risks were in which we all face. I think people have a very strong, well-developed sense of preservation of their lives and for those they love. And that therefore the informed personal responses, I like the phrase, I think it was you, Professor Parker, who used that phrase, informed personal responses, can be extraordinarily effective, I think, in reducing the spread of viruses and the damage that they do. I have a sense, it's difficult to get firm evidence on it, but I have a sense that not very much weight was put upon that in the response to COVID. And that one of the reasons why I think, as I explained a bit yesterday, the costs of some of the most restrictive measures ran ahead of the benefits was that many of the voluntary responses to information about risks would have rather effectively brought down some of those risks in a way which the introduction and the period over which lockdowns were kept in place didn't seem to quite factor in. So that was one thing. And I think we've probably learned rather a lot, in fact, from the COVID episode about people's responses to a very serious set of health risks. The second thing, and again, at the risk of repeating myself from things I've already said, the second thing I think could be done better would be to pay more attention to longer-term implications of some of the measures, particularly the most restrictive measures, where I think there was a tendency to focus very much on what the impact might be on, for example, the spread of a virus over the next few weeks, perhaps months, which of course is of great significance, but without thinking too much about what might be the impacts further down the road, the negative impacts of particular restrictions, which I think in the case of lockdowns, one thing we are learning now is just how high those costs could be.
Okay. Assumption, your view on this?
First of all, there are some institutional measures that can be taken in advance, but not that many, because very often the institutional response to a pandemic will depend on the particular characteristics of the pathogen which emerges. But it seems to me that there are some things which one can do. For example, one can set up in advance contingency planning in some detail for tracking and tracing infected persons. That is something which, for example, Germany did in advance of the pandemic. It broke down at the peak after some months because of the sheer volume, but it certainly helped at an early stage. In addition, I think that we need to attend to the very low levels of critical care capacity in the National Health Service. In European terms, Britain's critical bed capacity is, I think, lower in proportion to its population than any other country except Malta. And it, for example, was substantially lower than countries like South Africa, which are considerably poorer. And that, I think, needs attention. But those are the limited institutional measures one can take. Things like testing are difficult to plan in advance without knowing more about the pathogen, and by definition one doesn't. I think the second requirement is that there should be a very clear and comprehensive framework of decision-making, which would identify the kind of problems that we've been discussing over the last day and a half. What are the vulnerable groups when it comes to an infectious pathogen? How do their needs, their vulnerabilities, and their exposures to risk differ? What are the kind of measures that we need to consider? What are the longer-term implications of some of those measures that we also need to consider? I don't think it's possible to lay down answers, but it is possible to identify questions which decision makers should address. Thirdly and finally, I think the vital thing is to avoid being so prescriptive that you end up with a plan that's basically irrelevant to the crisis as it develops. And that includes avoiding one-size-fits-all or block solutions which fail to differentiate between different sources of risk. I think that one of the many quite impressive things about the Swedish response, and forgive me for going on about Sweden, but it came out very clearly, I thought, from the evidence that you heard from Dr. Tegnell last week, is the way in which Sweden responded with a large number of micro measures, each of which was tailored to a particular source of risk. And that was a highly effective method of dealing with a problem by comparison with the kind of top-down, one-size-fits-all approach which tended to be adopted at the most distant level, i.e. ministerial level, from individuals and vulnerable groups. And that, I think, is an object lesson which we ought to build into our framework of decision-making. Don't assume that the right thing to do is the same for every sector of the population.
Thank you very much. We've reached midday. When we come back this afternoon, we will entertain questions that have been put to us by core participants. But I will also like, before we do that this afternoon, to give you the opportunity of just making some concluding thoughts, or giving us some concluding thoughts, having gone through this hearing today and yesterday, and I'll allow you to consider that over lunch. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Gale. Now, we're going to have lunch, but can again I remind and ask co-participants or legal representatives who want to submit a question and haven't already done so, that the time limit for doing that is 12:30 today. So again, such applicants should be made using the form provided in Appendix A to the Rule 9 procedure relating to these hearings, which is published on our website. We'll now adjourn and return at 1:45. Thank you.